right, guys, how you doing? We're gonna do another tech video here, and got some imps running around the shop here that might kick the tripod, so please understand. I'm not in my normal digs this time. I'm out at my friend Dave's shop. He runs a place called Moto Europa in southern Hanover County, Virginia, outside of Richmond. He works on BMWs. He does restorations of classic airhead BMWs. He also works on Gucci's. And what else you work on, Dave?
The occasional Ducati.
The occasional Ducati. I assume that's because he's got PTSD from having worked on Ducatis at one point in his life.
Yes.
So this is where we're going to be doing the brake discs and the brake pads for my ever-present R1200 GS. You've seen this bike up on the lift a lot lately. The clutch is working really great now, so I don't have to worry about that. So the next thing is the discs and the pads. We're going to be using on the front, we're going to be using these new SBS. They're called 796 SP pads. They're sintered. They're really good pads. I can't wait to get them on. But I'm also using the opportunity to put new brake discs on my bike because my discs are at the point where they're just inside the allowed spec that BMW wants you to have. So they can go down to a certain spec. I'm not going to give you the spec because you should always look things up. Get your manual, get your shop manual, look it up. Same thing with torque values. Now, you're going to notice I don't have my manual because I actually know what I'm doing today, but I do have my list of torque values. So this is all the torque values I need to do this job, front and rear. To do this, you don't need any special tools except for some kind of a heat gun. And really, this just makes it a lot easier to do. You don't technically need one of these, but it will make the job go a lot faster. I'm also going to use two tools that you might not have in your toolbox. These are long Torx sockets. This is a T50, and that fits into the bolts on the back wheel, and it makes it just a lot easier so you're not busting your knuckles and you don't have to dig up an extension either. This is a T40 Torx, and this is to take the bolts out of the rear brake disc. Now, it's not itself a special tool other than it's kind of long, but I don't know if you can see this. I got a buddy with a metal lathe, and we necked it down about a third of the length so that it'll fit past the sides of the final drive without scratching it up with the little, corners that are on there. And then we put some shrink tube over it. I'm not sure how the shrink tube will work, but I guess we'll find out. So it's not a special tool. You don't have to have this, but if you do this more than once, it's a really handy thing to have. Other than that, I guess I could show you the disc. Where did I put the disc? Hold on just a second. Here's the disc for the rear. They only go on one way. They've got a little bevel so that you can see where the bolt goes right there. These are made by an Italian company called Braking, and they're pretty much standard steel discs. They're shaped different. This is a wave style rotor, they call them. They're lighter than the OEM discs. They're cheaper than the OEM discs sometimes. And they put right there on there, they tell you minimum thickness 4.25 millimeters. So what the lighter discs will do is reduce your unsprung weight, which improves your handling overall. Now, once I get them on there, I'm going to hit them with a little brake cleaner, wipe them off, put the new pads in, and everything will be hunky-dory. So you'll get a time lapse now of the work, at least on the rear, and we'll see. Over because I don't know how far up the frame goes, and I'm doing this by myself. So I got the old rear brake disc off. It came off really easy. 5 bolts. There's no Loctite on these, so I'm not going to put any on them to put them back in. As you can see from the discs here, I got the new disc in front and the old disc in back, and you can see that they are the same radius, but the wave disc has some cutouts. And what that's going to do is it's going to let the pad cover more of the surface of the disc, of the rotor, without wasting any space. And then the extra cutouts help keep the pads nice and clean as they go around. Truth be told, it's probably a little more hype than reality, but they do look cool and they work well. And the fancy ones like this cost a little bit less than the OEM disc. And I can feel, very unscientific, but I can feel that the braking, the wave rotor here is a little bit lighter than even the worn down, rear brake disc with 83,000 miles on it. So this is going to go in the steel recycling. Always recycle your hard parts. This is going to go on the bike. So we got the new brake disc in place. You can see it went right on, no problem. I had to borrow a torque wrench from Dave that goes down to a very small number. Remember, I'm not telling you what the numbers are because you need to look them up. But it goes down, it needed to be farther than mine was. So the spec calls to tighten these brake rotor bolts to one torque value. So you do them all 5. Then you go around and you do it again. Now, because you can't get to all the bolts at the same time, you basically have to rotate them around. I'll take a picture of this and put a close-up picture in the video. There's a cutout on the bottom of the final drive so that you can get to one bolt at a time. Normally, something like this, you would do it in a crisscross pattern like you do with your rear wheel. You do the crisscross, and then that kind of snugs things up gradually so that you don't warp anything. You don't want to warp your brand new brake disc. But you can't do that here. So they have an initial torque value, which is kind of tight. And then they have another torque value, which is the rest of the way tight. So that gives you that same effect as doing the star cross pattern. So the next thing we're going to do is, I'm going to put new brake pads in the rear caliper. So I'm going to cut the zip ties. I just zip tied it up to get them out of the way. I'm going to cut the zip ties. I'm going to pull it down. I'm going to move the camera in a little closer so that you can kind of see what we're doing. It's not difficult to change pads. It's just you don't need any special tools. We'll use needle nose pliers, and we might have to dig up a hammer and a drift to kind of punch the pins out, but it's not a hassle. So here we go. Okay, here we go. We're going to do the rear brake pads, and I had to borrow a big screwdriver from Dave. So there are tools that you can get to do this, but since we're kind of doing it quick and dirty, and we're spreading the old pads apart, which isn't a big deal, we're just going to use a screwdriver because it doesn't matter if we wreck them because we're not going to keep them. They're going in the steel recycling bin, so it doesn't matter. But you want to be careful if you use a big screwdriver like this on new pads because you don't want to scrape up, ding, scratch your new pads. But we're going to compress the piston. So on this kind of motorcycle, and a lot of motorcycles that have the rear pads like this, only the inner pad, only the pad that's on the outboard side of the wheel moves. The inside pad is fixed. So when you step on the rear brake, the inside pad squeezes into this. The rear pad stays where it is, but it kind of pushes the whole assembly together. And then that's what lets you stop. And then when you let off the brake, the motion, the action of the rear wheel turning the way it does, expands the two pads back apart. But the rear ones are almost always going to wear more quickly than the other one because that's just the way it works. All right, so we're going to cut this. Whoops, we're going to cut that twice because otherwise it's not coming out of that spot. And the reason we hung it up there is just so that it wasn't, number one, it wasn't in the way. So you can see this little pin here. So we're going to pull that pin out. It's like a cotter pin. Well, I mean, it probably is a cotter pin. Yeah, it's a cotter pin. but it's angled. Now you can replace these. This one is a little dirty. It's a little rusty. I didn't get another one, so we're not going to replace it. We're going to keep it. Now we got to get the pin out. And the pin has a large end, bang, and a small end, bang. So knock the hammer, or knock the pin out. I'm just going to put that right back in place on the disc. And then just give it a couple of taps with a hammer. There it goes. Now you can see that's the outside pad. That came out real nice. The inside pad's still captured. And you can see my pin's rusty. I definitely should have gotten a pin kit, and that's on me. Since I don't have one, these are going to go right back in. But I'm going to make a note in my maintenance journal to replace the pins the next time I do this job. Excuse me. So, oh, that's cool. I don't know if you can see here, but the thickness of the two pads is different. You can see there's a little hook at the front that goes up inside the cavity there, and then the pin goes through the back, and that holds them in place. You get a nice shot of my bald head there. These blister packs are so squicky. All right. So there's our nice new pads. Don't those look lovely? Oh yeah, look at that. Those are great. And then, let's see, Dave brought us something. So this is anti-seize. Goes right along with Uncle Stuck in the Mud. So we're going to put a little bit of this on the pin, and that'll help it move a little better, even though it's rusty. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you what, I'm probably going to go, the next time I go to my dealer, buy a pin. But right now I'm going to go hit these with a wire brush and just try and clean off as much of the rust as I can. So hold on for a second. So he's got a mechanical wire brush. I used it, cleaned almost all the rust off of there. So that's gonna go back in easier than it came out. That's for sure. So there's no real trick to getting these back in. You just got to kind of balance them as you secure them with the pin. So you get them in as far as they'll go. Make sure the holes line up, which is kind of the key to life. And the pin goes in. Once the pin's in, you may have to tap the back side of the pin a little bit with a hammer just to finish it off. Because you have to get it so that the hole for the cotter pin, oh, I forgot to put the, dummy. I forgot to put the anti-seize on. So let me knock those back out. You got it? Mm-hmm. Came out much easier that time. I was so intent on holding the pads in place.
I don't know what George's practice is.
Mm-hmm.
But I and you can decide whether you want to
sure.
do this or not. But I typically, you've got this little rattle cage or,
right.
or rattle piece here, and all it does is put pressure on the pads so they don't vibrate
right
in there. So what I oftentimes do, I'll just get a little smear of this so that the pads slip on this. They don't. That pressure isn't keeping the pads from the brakes from actuating.
Right.
I also, and some people don't do this, but I typically put a little bit of this
on the piston.
On the pistons, and I do that again because it kind of acts as a dampener to the pad action.
Okay.
and it will keep them quieter. It'll make it so that the brake pads or your brakes aren't going to be noisy. In other words.
So this is why it's handy to know people that are pros, because they give you tips like this. I didn't know any of this stuff.
You know, everybody's different. Some people don't do this kind of stuff, but I typically do. Anyway.
Well, thanks for the tip.
Don't put that on the brake pad surface, obviously.
Right, because you don't want the brake pad to be slippery.
You want some frictions.
Yeah, that's the whole point of brake pads, right? Okay, so now that we're all set, now we're going to work these things in there. Where'd I put the pin? There's the pin. Pin slides right in. Get a little love tap. Hold on. Dropped it out. There. Get those in. Oh, I missed one of the... Pay closer attention. I only got the pin through one of the pads. It's a little fiddly. It's not like a puzzle, but you do got to kind of hold everything in place. Now, since I dropped it, I'm going to check it and make sure that I didn't just get any grease on the pad. Get one in, get the other in. Excuse me. That in. Now we got to rotate the cotter pin. We'll put that back in, the tiny little hole that it goes in. Went right in. Okay. Now, I'll give the pads just a little bit of a spread, not a big one. Gently, because it's got to go over the top of the new rotor. Goes right over, no problem. We're going to thread the mounting bolts in gently. It's like you're running a business. Your caliper. And we're going to grab our torque wrench. Here's our list of torque values. Rear brake caliper mount. So we're going to set that on here.
That's right, that's right. New month. 30th today. You got a couple more days, mister. Ah, I see. Okay. Well, yeah,
Okay.
your lower end is completely
There, so the rear end is all done. There we go. Now remember, while you've got it up on the lift like this, it's real easy. Just get some fluid back in there. Make sure those pads come together. Stop the disc, and then let off the pedal. Make sure they stop. Okay, there you go. So now I'm going to put the rear wheel back on. I'm actually going to use my other wheels. You'll see what I'm talking about in a minute, and then we can start working on the front. Okay, so I've made myself a little stand here to work on the front wheel to change the brake discs out. Now these brake discs, the rotor bolts, absolutely have to have heat. because they come with, they've already got thread lock on. Oh, hold on, let me grab a new one. So right here, ladies and gentlemen, is why you always check your parts bin before you get working. These are new bolts for the back rotor. So what I'm going to do in a few minutes is go back over there, take the existing bolts out and put these bolts in, because that's what's supposed to be in there. So that's a dopey move on my part. But that shows you, I guess I don't have to pull the front ones out of the bag to show them to you. So that blue stuff on there is Loctite, thread lock, whatever you want to call it. The front bolts are, the new front bolts are the same. They're just a little bit longer. So I'll show you one in real time, and then we'll do the others in a time lapse. This is just a heat gun. It's a nice heat gun that Dave had. So we just want to get that thread lock just the tiniest bit, you know, out of solid. And once we do that, that bolt will come right off. Let's give it a test. See, it just comes right off. Now, that bolt is hot, so don't grab it. So we're going to do the other ones. You'll see that I'll switch to time lapse. Just a couple of minutes to cool off, because the last thing you want to do is burn your hands grabbing a nice hot brake disc bolt. So we're going to pull that out. Okay, and here's what I want to show you. You can see that there's a bunch of little extra parts, so they're all kind of rusted together, but there's a, let me pull this around so you can see it better. I don't know, I hope you can see that. So here's the little puck that lets the disc float. I don't know what the real name for that is. And then underneath it, there's a flat washer and also a wavy washer. And that helps keep the brake disc snug against the holding so that it doesn't whistle. They kind of sing if you're not careful, if you don't put all the washers in. So whatever this button is, or stud, and then the two flat washer and the wave washer. And then here's the one of the old bolts. And you can see there's just a tiny little bit of the original thread lock still on there. So the new bolts will have a lot more of that. And then, so I'm going to swap the bolts on there, or the disc. Let me get my parts bucket. It's good practice not to throw anything away until you're all done, just to make sure that you still have all the parts that you need. In case you have to put something back together, you can't put your new parts on. You've still got the old parts. So we're going to hold on to these. And once again, be careful, make sure it's not too hot. And there's the old disc. Now here's the new disc, and once again, I can tell that the new disc is a little bit lighter. Okay, so we're gonna put this out of the way. And here's the new disc. Now these are directional, but they made it really easy. One side has all the logos, one side is completely blank. So the side with the logos goes out, because what good is it otherwise, right?
Crazy dogs in a hand, she's in a room.
Okay, so you just saw me put the new brake pads, the SBS pads. Oh, I forgot. There's your product. Oh, I just got my nice new clean hat dirty. Oh well. The new SBS pads on both front calipers. The front calipers are actually really easy. They're much easier than the rear. You don't need pliers to pull out it's not really a cotter pin, it's kind of a lock pin, sort of. But those, the pins on the front calipers spin right out. They're a little fiddly, you gotta kind of hold the pads in there and press down on the tensioner that helps keep noise down. You saw earlier where Dave showed me how to squeeze some copper anti-seize grease onto some of the fittings to help keep the noise down. So we did that. But holding that pressure pin, pressure plate, whatever BMW calls it, I'll have to look it up. Here, I'll pause. There, I just put the part number up for you. You have to hold that with your hand and kind of wiggle things in. But the front pads are actually really easy to change, which is good because you go through those more often than you go through the rear pads. The rear pads are I know people that get, 2 sets of front pads to every 1 set of rear pads and things like that. So now we're gonna put a jack under here just to lift the front end up a little bit. Swap the wheel that you watched me do the brake discs on for this wheel. And then we'll be all done, and then we'll go for a test ride. Now there's some things about doing your brakes you want to remember. Brake pads and the dust that they create are toxic. They put asbestos in brake pads. It's about the only thing left in the world that they still put asbestos in. Asbestos can cause cancer. I should have been wearing gloves. I wasn't. So anytime you work on brakes, brake calipers, brake pads, brake components, make sure that you wash thoroughly. Wash your hands really good. Asbestos, mesothelioma, the kind of cancer you get from asbestos exposure, is no joke. Also, make sure that you properly dispose of your parts. Cardboard can be recycled, steel can be recycled. If you don't feel like bothering with recycling your steel, your brake discs, your brake pads, those kinds of things, take them to your dealer. They'll throw them in a bin. Sooner or later that bin gets full. They're going to take them down to the scrap yard and get 3 cents a pound for that stuff. So you're helping them out by giving them your old stuff. So we're going to balance the front wheel, then we're going to throw it on the bike, and then we're going to go for a test ride. Now, it's also important when you do your brakes to remember that you've taken some of the slack out of the system. Your new pads are fat, your old pads were skinny. So you got to pump those brakes to get that contact in there. And new disc rotors, new brake pads, they're going to take a little bit of time to bed in. So just like with brand new tires, take it easy for the first couple 100 miles. Give yourself plenty of time and distance to stop until you're sure that you've got your brake pads and your new rotors bedded in. All the manufacturers will tell you that. I'm going to tell you that. So just be careful, be aware you've got new brakes on your bike, so ride accordingly until you're positive that they're working exactly how you want them to. I want to thank Dave Carmean again from Moto Europa in extreme southern Hanover County outside of Richmond, Virginia, for letting me use his shop space, some of his tools, and a lift here. You saw that we didn't use terribly too many tools that you wouldn't have at your house. So this is absolutely something you can do in your garage at home on your own even. So take it easy. We'll see you next time. I think what's up next is shocks. I'm going to be putting a set of Touratech shocks on here.